Okay. Good morning. Thank you for coming. I think most of you know me. I'm Pat Fitzgerald-Bocarza. I'm the provost for Rutgers Biomedical Health Sciences, Newark campus. And on behalf of myself and Sangeeta Lamba, who is the Vice Chancellor for Diversity and Inclusion, we welcome you to our seminar today. I know people are still wandering in, and that's fine. I want to introduce Dr. Sudeep Parikh. He carried out his undergraduate studies at the University of North Carolina. Early in his career, he was a presidential management intern at the NIH. He was awarded an NSF Graduate Research Fellowship while earning his PhD in macromolecular structure and chemistry at the Scripps Institute. There he used structural biology and biochemistry techniques to probe the mechanisms of DNA repair enzymes. From 2001 to 2009, he served as science advisor to the U.S. Senate Appropriations Committee, where he was responsible for negotiating budgets for the National Institutes of Health, the CDC, the Agency of Healthcare Research and Quality, Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, and other scientific and health agencies, and was part of the group that doubled the NIH budget over, I think that mostly during that period. He was a vice president, then served as a vice president at Battelle, a multi-billion-dollar research and developmental organization where he led 2 business units with over 500 scientific, technical, and computing experts. Immediately prior to joining the AAAS, Parikh was senior vice president and managing director at DIA Global, a neutral multidisciplinary organization for healthcare product development. He became the 19th CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and executive publisher of the Science family of journals in January of 2020. And we'll all recall that that was a rather monumental time in the life of science in the United States, with all the shutdowns coming that March. Overall, he has spent 2 decades at the nexus of science, policy, and business. He's an active member of the science advocacy community. He serves as board member and officer for several impactful organizations, including Research America, which he has chaired since 2023, Friends of Cancer Research, and ACT for NIH. He also serves as co-chair of Science and Technology Action Committee, Science CEO Group, and the Coalition for Trust in Health and Science. He's also a member of the Board of Life Sciences of the U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. He is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Science and the Council on Foreign Relations. He has received multiple public service awards, including recognition from the Society for Women's Health Research, the American Association of Immunologists, the National AIDS Alliance, the Coalition of Health Science Services Research, and the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation. So we're excited to hear about your work in science policy, and welcome you.
Thank you, Pat. I got to shorten that biography. I'm sorry about that. Really sorry. Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. I'm excited to spend some time with you. I have a whole bunch of different things I wanted to talk about today, and it almost ended up being 100 slides. And so I stopped myself. So I put the phone here with the timer on to give you the illusion that I'm going to finish in just a few minutes. So let's see how it goes. I wanted to start today with a little story. So Pat mentioned that I worked in the Senate on the Appropriations Committee for 10 years. During that time is when I really learned how to talk about science with folks who are not in the sciences. And the story I tell sometimes to talk about that is not long after I got there, I was called to the Senate floor. There was an appropriations bill that was being passed. Does anybody know what appropriations means? It means spending money. It's a big deal. It's how the U.S. government chooses what to spend money on. And there was an appropriations bill on the Senate floor that was in the midst of being passed when a senator from Kansas put an amendment on it that would have blocked the creation of animal-human hybrids. Animal-human hybrids. Now that sounds good because we don't want centaurs running around, but it turns out that legislation is a really blunt instrument. And so the same language that stops the creation of centaurs also stops recombinant DNA. And we didn't want that. And so, so I got called down to the cloakroom of the Republican side, where the chair of that committee said, well, first of all, how should I vote on this? And I said, well, it's a bad amendment. It blocks something that we really want to continue doing, recombinant DNA. So then he says, well, give me an example of an experiment that you can't do if this amendment passes. And I got all excited. Now, this is the year 2000. So I was talking about green fluorescent protein and how you could watch molecules inside of cells. And the chairman says, that's great, Sudip, but say something that I can say, because I don't know what you're saying right now. And he's a smart guy. Look, he's a lawyer. He's probably just walked out of a hearing on nuclear weapons or something like that. He's a really smart guy. But so I think about it and I say, well, okay, I know an experiment that is pretty simple to understand. And that is a diagnostic for fertility treatments, where you take a human sperm and you put it with a hamster egg, and you say, you check to see if the human sperm can join with the hamster egg. Nothing happens, but you're checking the vitality and the motility of the sperm. And I thought that's an easy one. He's going to get this. And he leans back in the chair and he says, Sudip, what's a hamster? And I thought he was kidding. And so I said, well, a hamster is a mammal, and it's bigger than a mouse, and it's smaller than an aardvark. And then I was kicking myself because I don't know what an aardvark is. I don't know if y'all do, but I don't know what an aardvark is. Luckily, he did not ask me that. He said, okay, and he walked out onto the Senate floor, and he mangled all of it. But he's the chair of the committee, and the chair of the committee brings 18 votes with them. And so the amendment failed, and everything went on happily. And the next day in the congressional record, I tried to clean it up a little bit. It's still, if you go back there and look at it, it's not cleaned up completely. But the right thing happened. And I'll tell you that story to illustrate a couple of things. One is, first of all, because of time spent with that member of Congress, he trusted me enough to ask, which way should I vote on this? And he trusted the answer that I gave. And that takes time to build that level of trust. The second thing is that it's not necessarily the beauty of your talking points that carries the day. It is being in the right place, talking to the right member of Congress to influence the process in a way that should happen, so that you get the right result. And I'm going to carry that through the rest of this talk. I'm going to try and move my slides forward here. Let's see. All right. Maybe if I just press it. Oops. Here, pressing that button. There we go. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Luckily, I told this story before, and our communications department actually went to the trouble of finding out what an aardvark is. And I learned that an aardvark can be almost 7 feet tall, or 7 feet long from snout to tail. So it turns out I was right about the comparison, but I got lucky on that. One of the things that I like to start my talks with is the fact that we live in wondrous times. Sometimes we're living through this moment in history where it's easy to sort of get down on what's happening in the world, and you start to think that there's no progress being made. But in fact, we live in absolutely wondrous times. If you look at what we know about the universe, about this planet, and about ourselves, it's beyond anything we've ever known before. And the rate at which we're learning things is incredible. And so these pictures on this slide illustrate some of that. The one in the center there is Pluto. Those are the methane-covered mountains of Pluto. Pluto has ice mountains made out of water that have a dusting of methane on top of them. The fact that we know that as human beings is extraordinary to me. The fact that we know that in such exquisite detail. Because when I was 15 years old, Pluto was 6 pixels. 6 pixels. And now we know exactly what's on this planet. Sorry, it's not a planet anymore either. I guess that changed. Up in the top left is an illustration of CRISPR-Cas9. And in this department, you all know what that is. The fact that we can edit the genome in such an exquisitely sensitive manner, and the fact that it was discovered in 2012, and here in 2024, we have We have products on the market that make use of that technology. That's extraordinary. That's amazing to me. In the top right is the ATLAS experiment at CERN. And that is an experiment to understand the fundamental particles of nature and to understand and try and recreate some of the conditions around the Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago. And the fact that we can understand what atoms are made of, again, is an extraordinary thing. Down the bottom left is an Earth observing satellite, Calypso. I could have put 100 different other Earth observing satellites up there. If you are wondering about the state of our planet, we now have a measuring system that's just like if you were in an emergency room. We are measuring in fine and precise detail so many things about the Earth and our planet. In the bottom right is a representation of gravitational waves. So just in the last 10 years, we've realized that we can detect ripples in space caused by gravity. So what those are is a black hole ran into another black hole 10 billion light years away, and we can feel the ripples in space from that. It's stretching us, the very fiber of our being, it's stretching us. And we know this because we can measure it. The fact that human beings can understand that about ourselves is wondrous. It is absolutely wondrous. And never let anybody tell you that we don't live in wondrous times. And it reminds me of a time 150 years ago when Michael Faraday was studying the electron. And Faraday in the 1850s and 1860s was just starting to understand what an electron was. And so William Gladstone, who at that time was the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, he asked Faraday about the practical value of electricity. What's this good for? And Faraday gave like one of the best answers I've ever heard of. It's an apocryphal answer. I'm not sure if it's true or not. He said, one day you're going to be able to tax it. He doesn't know what it is, but someday you're going to be able to tax it. And he was so right, because in 1850, electrons were magic. They were magic. They were things that you couldn't detect, you couldn't see, and yet they acted on the world. And then by 1920, they were the source of the biggest growth in GDP and economy and work and productivity that's ever been seen by humans. It was magic. It was absolute magic. And so that brings to mind this cover of Science from a couple of years ago, which was about a paper that described the fact that the W boson, which is a subatomic particle, is slightly heavier than predicted by the standard model of physics. Now, if you don't know what I'm saying there, I don't either. The standard model of physics is what describes our world, and it's really, really precise. But we know it's wrong. We know it's wrong. And this is one of the first observable measurements of that. Now, it's 7% heavier than predicted by the standard model. But what that means is, if it's, and it has to be repeated, is that there's more physics out there. There's more physics out there. And the same thing applies. I have no idea what it means. It is magic to us right now. It is absolute magic to us what this physics is. But someday, if we can make it that long, we're going to tax it. The W boson, that paper shows you exactly what Faraday saw 150 years ago. And so I've told you a whole bunch of things that are exciting about the world that we're in, and how it is wondrous, and how every time you talk to your families, or you talk to your parents, or you talk to your kids, there should be a light in your eyes. Because in every discipline, it's biology, it's biochemistry, it's physics, it's math, every one of them is moving at a pace that we've never seen before. The challenge is we also live in uncertain times. This slide depicts some of those uncertainties. And I'm not going to go through all of them. I've listed them out here on the next page, which is climate change, the need for energy storage and transmission, because all those electric cars are running on grids that are 120 years old. Global competition and economic prosperity, jobs, public health and healthcare, food and water insecurity. These are challenges. These are big challenges for a population of 8 billion people on this planet. And so, yes, we live in those wondrous times. We also live in uncertain times. The bigger challenge, I think, is that we also live in tumultuous and polarized times. And I don't have to tell you all this. You turn on the news every day. You know that that politics, that misinformation and disinformation, that a whole bunch of other things are working together, and they're not coordinated, but they might as well be, to really tear apart at the fabric of our society. And that affects everything, including the sciences. And so when you look at public confidence in scientists and medical scientists, it's declined over the past few years. Medical scientists are there on the left. That's most of you all. 78% trust you either a great deal or a fair amount. That's actually pretty good. Scientists are right there with you at 77%, and that's above the military, which usually the military is one of the highest, and that's at 74%. But this is decreasing. The trend line isn't good. I do want to give a reality check in that scientists are probably still the most trusted of anyone out there. If you look at police officers, that's lower. If you look at school principals, that's lower. Religious leaders, much lower. Journalists, much lower. And elected officials, nobody trusts. Well, actually, there's 2%. 2% of folks in this survey said they trusted them a lot. I want to meet these 2%. I haven't met them in real life yet. But one of the challenges is that trust in science is split along party lines. And so this table here, or this chart here, comes from the AP, and it shows that despite the fact that going back to 2006, it was almost equal in terms of confidence in science and the scientific community, that split has become almost 2 to 1 in the year 2023. And the other thing you're seeing is that this polarization, this uncertainty, has also led to the proliferation of conspiracy theories. And this is one of my favorite ones. This one is a conspiracy theory that's out there that the Large Hadron Collider, which is at CERN, is creating parallel universes. And that when they turned it on back in 2012, we all went down the wrong one. Now, sometimes I do think that might be true, but in all seriousness, it's really a shame that people can believe this kind of thing. There are people that believe that we are creating portals to other universes to bring in demons through the Large Hadron Collider. If you don't believe me, Google it. But I have to warn you, it's going to send the algorithms in a bad place for you on all your social media. So just know that you're going to get more and more conspiracy theories. But they also believe that because we went down this wrong parallel universe, that things have changed. It's called the Mandela effect. I don't know if you've ever seen this. So there are a lot of folks out there, it's in the millions, who believe that Nelson Mandela's name was spelled with 2 L's before CERN was turned on, and that now it's spelled with 1 L, and that this is proof that we're living in a parallel universe. And they've got a whole bunch of examples of this. And it's wild. And yet it's really hard to challenge because people's understanding and faith is probably the wrong word, the credibility they give science is no longer there. And so it's one of the reasons why we wrote this little piece for Pew, which I'm not going to talk too much about, except for to say that I'm going to go over the points in this deck. Now, one thing that we know is that trust is gained in teaspoons and lost in buckets. And so this is a piece that just hits home for me about losing trust in buckets. During the pandemic, the FDA, whoever runs the social media there, tweeted out this thing on the left, which is, you're not a horse, you're not a cow, seriously, y'all, stop it in terms of taking ivermectin. Now, one of the challenges with this is that ivermectin is taken by humans for certain conditions. The problem is that it doesn't show any efficacy against COVID. But when my mom and dad got COVID, and when Joe Rogan got COVID, they did the same thing, which is they threw everything in the kitchen sink at it. So my mom and dad took Paxlovid, but they also took every Indian home therapy that you could possibly take. They did that. And I wasn't going to stop. I wasn't going to stop because you try talking to my mom and dad about the fact that that might not be tested in a placebo-controlled trial. Not going to happen. Joe Rogan did the same thing. He took the vaccine, but he also tried ivermectin. And it was about the same time as this tweet. Now, one of the challenges for all of us is that, Science Magazine, we reach 4 million unique visitors every week, which we think is a lot. Joe Rogan reaches 100 million people a day. A day. And so when he, in particular, looks at that tweet and says the FDA is lying to us, that reaches a lot of people. It reaches an incredible number of people. And you end up losing trust in buckets by not being precise in that social media post. And we have to be careful about this, because no matter how much work we do to build up a credible enterprise, we can lose it all in a bad tweet. And so then what happens is that a small number of underpowered studies gain traction. And so you've got the Florida Surgeon General quoting 2 preprints and then a whole bunch of studies, I'll say, that are showing that randomized controlled trials of either hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin are showing efficacy, which they do not in larger trials. But this is what can happen once you've lost a little bit of faith, because then once you've lost that confidence and lost that credibility, it's very hard to counter this. And so we're at this critical juncture in history, and you've got these large challenges in front of us. And we have to figure out, how are we going to be able to marshal this wondrous science that we just talked about, that is allowing humans to look at the universe. We're just the universe looking at itself, as people have said, and know as much as we do, while confronting these everyday things that folks who are not scientists no longer believe us. And where it leads me to think is that we're headed for 2 possible paths of the future. On our best days, on our most optimistic days, science can be used to address giant challenges, whether it's feeding 10 billion people soon enough, whether it's curing disease, or whether it's creating awe. We can do that in the sciences. But the other side of it is, we can not be trusted. We can be used to cause harm. We can be used to spread disinformation. Both those worlds are possible, just like in that CERN experiment. But I'm an optimist, and I'm an optimist born of evidence. Sometimes people say you can't be an optimist because it makes you naive. You must not be reading the news. You're ignorant of the facts. I'm not. I spent a lot of time bathed in the facts of our society. And yet I'm an optimist born of evidence. And I'll give you a few examples. On the left is the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. It was signed by Lyndon Johnson. Before that act, I wouldn't exist, because Asians weren't really allowed into the country, at least not at very high levels. And in 1965, that changed. And my family came just a couple years after that. That act is the reason I exist. Up in the top, the smallpox vaccine, that's a bifurcated needle. That's about a 10-cent device. That bifurcated needle is the reason that we don't have smallpox anymore. Any of you who are over 50 have a scar on your shoulder. That scar is from that bifurcated needle. It's where someone took it and they jabbed at you a few times. And that's what protected you from smallpox. But those of us under 50, you don't have that scar. You don't have it because you don't need it. Smallpox is gone. It's been eradicated. And it was eradicated in the midst of the Cold War. In the middle of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union worked together to eradicate smallpox. Hundreds of millions of people were affected by that disease, and now no one is. That's extraordinary. That is a reason for optimism. And it was done in a time that people thought the world was going to end. Down the bottom there is the AAAS board officers from 2023 and 2024. Amazing people. I won't go through who all they are. But I want you to contrast that with the fact that this is a 176-year-old organization. It was founded in 1848, before the Civil War. Before the Civil War. The 87 guys who founded it, and they were all guys, they were all white guys, in Philadelphia, probably never imagined a board that looked like this. They never imagined an organization that is most likely majority women now. They never imagined an organization where the board of directors is absolutely majority women. And yet here we are. And there's no, these folks are all still Nobel Prize winners and members of the National Academy. That hasn't changed. What's changed is that we're now pulling from the full breadth of the talent of our country. That to me is extraordinary. An organization has gone through evolution and revolution to get here. They never imagined a guy named Sudip Parikh would be their CEO. And here we are. Then on the right is the Sesame Research Center. We went there in October of 2023. Not that long ago, October of 2023. This is in a suburb of Amman, Jordan. We flew there flying over the West Bank and Jerusalem. And what's amazing to me is that at this synchrotron, this is a synchrotron built into the hills and suburbs around Amman, Jordan. There are Israelis and Palestinians, Egyptians, Iranians, Europeans, all working together in science. Working together in science. And they're using that science for extraordinary things, like understanding the history of the area in which they live. Because it turns out you can use soft synchrotron beams to understand the age of dyes, to understand the molecular structure of dyes, and to understand the technology that was around 2,000, 3,000, and 4,000 years ago. It's a pretty amazing thing to watch. And it gives me hope for a very troubled region. So I'm an optimist born of evidence. It doesn't mean that things always go right. It means that it's possible, and that the only thing that makes it possible is people. So hope and optimism aren't enough. You have to have a plan, right? You can have plenty of hope and optimism. You have to have a plan. So what's the plan? Well, AAAS, we have a vision statement. I won't read it to you other than to say that the subject of that vision statement is community, scientific community. That's what we have the ability to affect. Everything those adjectives, they matter to us: inclusive, mobilized, and global. But that community is who we can affect, and we can affect it for the better. And so that plan includes 4 pieces. Now I'm going to go through them one at a time. The first is advancing scientific excellence and achievement. Now this is something that those 87 guys in Philadelphia, they would recognize this. This is about the fact that we want the best science. We want discovery. We want awe-inspiring work to come out of our laboratories and out of our observations. And so every year we do things like the Breakthrough of the Year. So when you get Science Magazine in December, you know that there's a Breakthrough of the Year. In 2023, that was GLP-1 agonists. The year before that was a James Webb Space Telescope. It can be a whole bunch of different things. And this amazes me. James Webb Space Telescope allows us to look at atmospheres in planets outside our galaxy. We'll be able to see methane, know that there's something spewing out methane on a planet. That is outside our galaxy. We could know if there's something living outside our galaxy. GLP-1 agonists, I don't have to tell you, all know this better than I do, could be a treatment for many things beyond diabetes and beyond obesity. You all are going to have to tell us that, but it certainly seems like a very promising area. But we also have to clean up our own house. So this also includes scientific integrity, and you've seen these headlines: challenges for great scientists, leaders of institutions, but also scientists who want to get ahead and try and take some shortcuts. When we do this, we hurt the edifice and the credibility of science. We can't allow that culture to take root in the enterprise. And so Holden Thorpe, who's our editor-in-chief at Science, has written a lot about this, but one of the things he said is correction is courageous. Because one of the challenges for us is that when we publish something, we feel bad if we realize there's a mistake. We realize there's a mistake. But as he says in the pull quote here, a scientific ecosystem that is free of errors is unattainable. It's not true. We're all human. We make mistakes. And so correction ought to be not just courageous, it ought to be normal. And we see that. So we have a paper that was just retracted in Science recently, a climate paper that was retracted within the first couple of weeks because the data was made openly available. The data was looked at by others, and a flaw was seen in the equations that were used to analyze that data. And within a couple of weeks, we realized the paper didn't hold up. And so it was retracted within a month. This should be normal. It shouldn't hurt the career of that scientist to be willing to say, we goofed on that one. We still have a great body of work. We goofed on that one. And so science, the journal, has to be a leader in assuring scientific integrity. And so we've done a whole bunch of things, including adopting technologies that allow us to detect altered images, that allow us to detect plagiarism. But it can't all just be about the technology trying to find this stuff. It's got to be a part of our culture in the scientific community that we don't want this in the community. And so, yes, we're going to have technologies, but those technologies are in a war with each other. We're using AI to detect AI. That's not a good situation. The best place to be is when the culture of the enterprise stops us from doing this. The second part of what we do at AAAS is to foster the equity and inclusion for scientific excellence that's needed, that's required. We believe that a diversity of thought, a diversity of background, a diversity of identity is actually a prerequisite for scientific excellence. And we've seen that. And our vision here is that one day, any child anywhere is going to consider it their birthright and have the support structures they need to feel a sense of belonging and to pursue a career in STEM. That doesn't happen today. We know it doesn't happen today, but that's our vision. So how do we make that happen? Well, first thing is by going beyond what we call eloquent words. People can write eloquent words about this. We see it all the time. And so we've tried to say, what are the concrete things that we can do as an organization? And so I'm not going to go into each of those things that we're doing right now, but I'll go through a few examples. One is that we have to move beyond interventions. Interventions are things like scholarships. Scholarships are great. That's terrific. But you know what? That can't be the only thing because that doesn't change the underlying problem. And so a few examples include things that are about the system. So the first one is public access publishing that doesn't charge you a price to publish. Because it turns out that people do this differently. If you're a senior researcher with lots of grants, it's not a big deal to you. Paying $5,000 or $10,000 or $13,000 to publish a paper doesn't hurt you that much. But it turns out if you're an early career scientist, if you're an assistant professor just starting out, this is a big part of your funds. And if you can't pay to publish, then how are you going to have the fruits of your research to show in your tenure package? How do you then move up that career ladder? There's a systemic problem here. And it turns out that waivers aren't a good idea. As a kid, I got free school lunches. And I remember to this day the feeling of that piece of paper that was my free school lunch. A waiver to get past this doesn't fix the underlying problem. That's a treatment, not a cure. But we have to figure out ways to do that. And at Science, we have figured out ways to do this. They don't work for everybody. We've got to work through it. But the one thing we can't do is let commercial publishers drive us toward this way of saying we have to pay for every paper. The second thing here, we need career ladders and real salaries for grad students and postdocs. Now, that doesn't mean that we make them all employees, but it can be employee-like benefits because frankly, people are in these roles in their 20s and 30s. And you have to be able to start families. You have to be able to live a life. We have to have people that want to come into this profession who aren't doing it because they have a life of luxury or a parental safety net that allows them to do it. We had to modernize our own governance. Our governance was written in the 1840s. Turns out that, you know what it was like back then? You'd sit around in a room and say, you're going to be the next president, and then you'll be the next president. Can't do that in a world where there's 4 million unique visitors to the Science webpage every day or every week. Because what that means is there's 4 million people that should be involved in that process. And then lastly, we need a national strategy that says what we're going to accomplish. Because it turns out if you have no plan, you don't get anything done. You'll be talking about the same problem 5 years from now without any metrics that you haven't done anything on. And so you have to have a plan. And more than performance, this is personal. This is a great editorial that Holden wrote in Science. It's called Science Needs Neurodiversity. I'd encourage you to read it. Holden is on the autism spectrum, and he writes about that and what it's like to be in the sciences when you are neurodiverse. This is something extraordinarily important because it turns out a large percentage of scientists, larger than you would ever think, are neurodiverse. We also have programs where we recognize systemic change in universities and in our institutions around the country. And I'm excited to say that Rutgers Health is our first Sea Change Biomedicine Bronze Award winner. And what that means is you've done the work of looking at yourselves, looking at your own demographics, setting baselines, and saying, what can we do about the challenges that we see? What are the changes that we can make in terms of hiring? What are the changes that we can make in terms of support systems that can ensure that we're drawing upon the talent of the entire country, and for that matter, the entire world? So, lovely quote here from Chancellor Strom. We're making history as the first in the nation to receive a Biomedicine Bronze Award. A new category with sea change. The award highlights the progress, the internal efforts, and the commitments that we've made to enhance efforts for inclusion and health equity here at Rutgers Health. This recognition can be leveraged as we support external funding of our scholarly efforts to highlight and further advance related goals. Now, the thing to read into that is that we can be proud of the fact that we're doing this. That's what that says in that last sentence. Be proud. The third thing we do is build trust among scientists and communities. And our vision here is that scientists and engineers are going to have strong, trusted relationships in their communities before that trust is needed. Because you can't develop trust in a crisis. You develop it before. And just like that story I told you about the hamster, the only reason why I got to go to that room is because I'd built a relationship over time. You have to have the relationship first. Especially because in our modern era, this statement has become really important. Belonging is more important than truth. We've seen this in a number of papers in science. There's a paper related to Facebook that talks about the fact that advertising at Facebook didn't really matter that much in the last election because we'd already sorted ourselves. We've sorted ourselves into tribes, and those tribes are where we have belonging. And if there's a truth, a fact that challenges your ability to persist in that faction, in that tribe, then it's not worth the social cost to believe that truth. You're better off in the belonging. And that's a big, big deal. What it means is that countering misinformation, you can't do it with facts alone. You've got to do it by building relationships. You have to be a part of those communities in order to have standing. It goes back to our challenges with CERN and the fact that if you don't have relationships with that community, then all they're seeing is science on TV and on social media. And what we know is that if you get protective knowledge ahead of time, that it can actually mitigate the effects later of disinformation. This is really, really amazing work by one of our board members, Kathleen Hall Jamieson, that shows that if you learn about RSV and what it causes, then even if you get disinformation later, your understanding of it holds up. You hold up against that wrong or malintent. And so what we have to do is build relationships across many areas. And so at AAAS, we've chosen some key societal influencers and policymakers that we're going to do this with. And one of the first is judges. Anybody who's been watching the Supreme Court realizes that judges are going to play a bigger and bigger role in public policy and in science policy. A recent Supreme Court decision has basically taken away the deference that judges used to give to experts in agencies. So the best example is FDA and medical devices. It turns out that because the language is rather ambiguous in terms of how it tells FDA to regulate medical devices, it means that judges will have the final say on medical device approval. That's wild to me. And so how do you work in that moment? You work by building relationships with those judges so that they have a source of scientific information that is stronger than what they read in the paper or what they pull off of social media. Second group is journalists. We know that even in this very segmented world that we live in, you can't just watch the 6 o'clock news on CBS or NBC or ABC. We know that you get news from everywhere. We know that journalists still play an important role in mediating that relationship between us and everyone else. And so they need to have really good information. And so we have programs that put scientists in newsrooms around the country, whether it's in Anchorage or the Washington Post or Puerto Rico. We have scientists in newsrooms around the country that are writing stories. They're writing stories and hopefully influencing what else comes out. We have a program that provides scientists to reporters, particularly general beat reporters, when they're trying to write a story about wildfires or earthquakes or climate change, so they can get a scientist that we've vetted and that we know can communicate well to participate in that story. And then lastly, faith leaders. In America, faith matters. It matters in a way that doesn't necessarily in Europe. And so we have to build relationships with the faith communities. So we have a program called Science in the Seminaries, where we help build curricula for seminaries. That's where faith leaders learn to become faith leaders. And they don't always agree with what goes on in that curriculum, but we can build a relationship as well. It turns out that if you want to ask somebody not to sing in church, it helps if you know them ahead of time. It helps if you know them ahead of time. And then the final one that we do is politicians and policymakers. This is a program that's been going on for 50 years. On the left is the first class in 1973. On the right is a class from a couple of years ago, about almost 300. These are scientists and engineers that we place either in Congress or in the executive branch to spend a year or two working directly with policymakers and building relationships with them. Now, one of the things that we want to make sure we're doing, and you see in our vision statement, is to see that expand to beyond just us. We need to build relationships before you need them in a crisis, and we need those at the local level as well. A county commission, a PTA, a health department, these all need those relationships, the same way we're trying to do it in Congress. And so we've created something called the Local Science Engagement Network, which we're starting to pilot around the country to see if we can help people in their local communities, scientists in their local communities, build relationships outside their laboratories. Because if you live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, or Boise, Idaho, and you're a scientist, then be a scientist. Be a scientist in your community. We also have programs to do science diplomacy, building bridges around the world. And we work in some of the toughest spaces in the world. Cuba, North Korea, and elsewhere. And we do this because we're trying to build bridges. Science is a universal language. It's a universal language. And when we are at our best, we're working on things that are to improve the human condition. And so that is one way of building relationships that hopefully can last even when geopolitics gets in the way. And in that vein, I traveled to China earlier this year. And just before that, I met with the ambassador from China. That's the left side, the left picture. And that same day, I happened to meet with Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State. And the beauty of it is I can say exactly the same thing to both, which is that on our best days, we should be working together. We should find ways to work together, particularly on things like cancer research, on things like human health, on climate change. Because when we put the two really peer nations working on research together, there's almost nothing we can't accomplish. Now, there's an S&T agreement that's being worked out with China. We've had it for 50 years, since 1979, almost 50 years. And it's in review right now at the State Department. You can guess that there's some deadlines in November that are going to determine when that gets approved. I hope it gets approved with the necessary transparency and security that I think is required in the 21st century. The other thing is, to build trust, you got to show up. You have to show up. And the House is having COVID-19 hearings. And you've probably seen some of these. They like to take scientific leaders and rake them over the coals. Now, they invited the editors-in-chief of Nature, Science, and The Lancet to come and testify. And they wanted to talk about the papers related to COVID-19. Now, every lawyer will tell you shouldn't go. You shouldn't go because nothing good can come of it, they would say. And so our colleagues at Nature and our colleagues at The Lancet did not show up. And so that's why there's 2 empty seats at the table there. Holden Thorpe, the editor-in-chief of Science, we made the decision that despite the risk, you got to show up. You have to show up. You have to engage. And I would encourage you to watch this hearing because you didn't hear about it in the news. You know why you didn't hear about it in the news? It turned out to be a hearing where they learned about peer review and where they learned about how science gets done. And I will say it was the most constructive of the hearings I've seen of that committee. And that's a committee that has Marjorie Taylor Greene and a few others. She didn't show up for Holden. But it's worth watching that hearing because if we're going to build trust, you can't You can't just decide you're not going to show up. It also tells you, anytime that somebody tells you that nature and science are the same thing, nature's a commercial publication. Lawyers determined who went. Science is run by a society, and we determined who went. Lastly, we catalyze progress where science meets policy. We do science policy. And that gets back to this what's a hamster thing. You have to engage, and sometimes it seems ridiculous. Sometimes you think, why am I doing this? But it's because you see the greater good that can come from it. The AAAS has been a part of advocating for science since it began. The United States government spends almost $200 billion a year on science and technology. The NIH itself is $47 billion a year. These are extraordinary numbers, and they don't just happen by accident. And they can change in an instant. This entire enterprise is fragile. And so we do a whole bunch of work, and I'm not going to go through all these things, but they're really at the basis of advocating for science at the federal level. The other thing we do is that papers in science have policy implications. We had satellite images that were able to show us where point emissions of methane were around the world. And you know where they are? They're refineries, oil refineries. That's where the point folks. And then there's also some natural places that emit methane. That's a policy piece of data that can inform policy. So science has something called the Policy Pack that it releases to journalists and to policymakers every week that talks about the implications of these research papers on policy. As I talked about the Supreme Court, there's a huge number of Supreme Court cases. If you're interested in this stuff, this is a moment that is unlike any other in the last 50 years, and it's worth paying attention. We have influence there. Justice Kagan, when she was asking questions during the oral arguments related to this recent case, she has quotes that sound very much like our amicus brief, our friend of the court brief. That's great. That means we have influence. The problem is Justice Kagan was on the wrong side of that decision. STPF, our Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program, is 50 years old, I mentioned to you, but we're changing it. We're evolving it. This year we had a group that had expertise in AI, because it turns out all the laws that were governing the internet were written in 1993. The laws that are going to govern AI for a long time are going to be written in the next 2 years. And so we need people there who understand this space. Do you know how hard it is to convince somebody who can make $300,000 or $400,000 a year in industry that they should take some time out and do a fellowship on Capitol Hill? It turns out it's not that hard, because all you have to say is, if you want to be there at the beginning, if you want to be there at the moment of creation for what this is in policy, then you need to go there right now. And it turns out we could get hundreds of people to apply who could go and make a lot more money elsewhere. And they will in a year after they do this fellowship. And then we also work in terms of training the next generation of science policy experts with students, graduate students, undergrads from 50 universities, 26 states. And these are universities that participate in these programs. They're terrific. It leads me to, since you all think about biomedical research, to just talk about NIH for a second. The pandemic really harmed the relationship between Congress and the NIH. I've been in Washington for 25 years, and NIH was always a source of bipartisan kumbaya. Everybody liked NIH. The pandemic has harmed that relationship, particularly with Republicans in the House and Senate. And it's put NIH under congressional scrutiny. And there are challenges related to public trust, transparency, and then the belief that NIH actually translates anything from discovery to medicine. And this has created two things. Congress has several approaches to solutions, some of which aren't good. And the research community has an opportunity to engage. That's a nice way of saying it. If you don't engage, we're in trouble. So the first vision is from Senator Bill Cassidy, who's a Republican from Louisiana. He's the ranking member of something called the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. You don't care about all that. The important thing is he has jurisdiction over the NIH. The last time the NIH was what's called reauthorized, a piece of legislation went through talking about it, was in 2006. And so Senator Cassidy is creating a pretty transparent process to get recommendations about what's needed. And there are needs to change. Turns out science has changed in 20 years, and we can do better. And I would say that his process is as transparent as you could possibly find. In the House, we have a different story. This Representative Kathy McMorris Rogers, who is the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee, has released a framework without any inputs that would be to reform the NIH. It would take apart several of the institutes at the NIH, including NIAID, for those of you who know about immunology. And it would restructure other institutes. It would also decrease funding for a lot of different places and put them into other places. But again, without comments, without any kind of process. And so our comments back to her have been, hey, there should be a transparent process, just like Senator Cassidy has. We've got to make sure that bad things don't happen sometimes as the work of science policy. And then there's another group that want to pass something called the Cures 2.0 bill. They've requested ideas. They want ideas about, the last Cures bill included funding for the Brain Initiative and for the Precision Medicine Initiative. Good things can happen, but you have to speak up. Whatever happens, we're going to be at the table. But lastly, I just want to talk about the fact that when we talk about the scientific ecosystem in the US, we often point to this book, this letter, written by Vannevar Bush in July of 1945. July of 1945. And so many of my science policy colleagues will talk about this book with reverence, incredible reverence. And it deserves reverence. It was in 1945, a very forward-looking product that really guided the creation of the National Science Foundation and a whole bunch of other things in the scientific ecosystem. The challenge is, it's 80 years old. I'm tired of talking about it. I don't want to point to work that was done 80 years ago to describe the scientific enterprise. We've got to lift the US out of this defensive crouch that we're in right now and really become again this energetic protagonist of our own story. We got to tell the story of what are the assets of the US scientific enterprise, and they are many. They are many. Like I talked about at the very beginning of this talk, we live in wondrous times, and it wouldn't be possible without the $200 billion a year that the US government puts into science and technology and the almost $800 billion a year that industry puts into science and technology in the United States. This is an enormous enterprise that we are a part of, and it can't live off a blueprint from 1945. And so we're going to have to work on this, and the AAAS is going to work on this. So what can we all do? I mentioned a few things. Clean our own house, make sure that scientific integrity is paramount. Acknowledge our own humanity. We make mistakes. We ought to be humble about them and say it when we do. We got to become more involved in our communities. And I know that's tough because you spend 48 hours out of a 24-hour day in a lab. But you know what? We have kids and families. We have parents. We have an enormous responsibility to them to participate in our communities, because if we don't, other people will. We got to build trust with key societal influencers and policymakers, and we got to do it before a crisis, because a crisis is no time to try and make friends. And we got to remember that trust is gained in teaspoons and lost in buckets. And what about this active disinformation that comes our way? You got to do all the stuff I said on the previous slide, but you've also got to inoculate against that disinformation with protective knowledge. We have to help construct knowledge. You do that in K through 12. We have to create coalitions for immediate and efficient response to this kind of thing. And then with humility, and I learned this from the US ambassador to Japan, we got to use our outside voices. This is not a time to be quiet. It's not a time to hole up. It's a time to be outside. And it doesn't work with huge advertising campaigns. That's not what turns people's minds. It is meeting someone and talking to them. And sometimes that is painful. I know my neighbors are painful. And yet you have to do that work, because if you don't, nobody else will. It's not hand-to-hand combat on social media. Nobody's ever convinced anybody of anything on social media. And so please don't try. We don't need more division. And all that means is that we all have this role to play in shaping that more optimistic future. And I'm convinced that we all can do it working together. Because of a quote from Margaret Mead, who was a AAAS president in 1975. She said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." I always liked that quote, even before I became the CEO of AAAS, and it means even more now. So thank you all for your attention. Thanks for being here. I appreciate you.
We're gonna try and do this both ways. If there's any questions in the room, and if there's questions in the audience, we'll try and pick them up as well. Just have to do because they really want to do it.
Yeah.
Janet, go ahead.
Hi, lovely talk, thank you.
Sure.
You mentioned K through 12 at the very end there, and I'm just curious what AAAS is doing. You also have the local engagement.
Yeah.
What is the
Yeah.
mission
Yeah.
there?
So for about 20 years, the AAAS worked on a new science curriculum called Project 2061. It's a great curriculum, and you can find it on bookshelves everywhere. Problem is, it's not in classrooms everywhere. And so how do you make that happen? And the way to do that is by working with organizations that are K-12 teachers, the American Physics Teacher Association, the American Science Teacher Association. These exist. These are real organizations. And we do that by collaborating with them and having them take the lead. Because it turns out nobody wants a scientist telling a teacher how to do teaching in the same way we don't always want teachers telling us how to do science. We have to build trusted relationships there as well and let them take the lead. I will say that funding is a challenge in some parts of the country, but funding isn't a challenge everywhere. The number of dollars that are spent in school districts per pupil around the country is pretty high and it's very uneven. And we've got to make sure that we find a way to at least get the basics. One challenge is when it becomes ideological. So for example, teaching evolution or teaching about climate change. And what I've found is that when you go to places that feel this way, there, again, you have to build a bond. And so I was invited recently to go speak on the floor of the House of Representatives in West Virginia. Now, to give you a sense of the state of West Virginia, there are 33 senators in the state Senate in West Virginia. 31 are Republicans and 2 are Democrats. The 2 that are Democrats are Republicans who changed party to run against somebody else. But because of that, there's a spectrum of Republicans in that state. And one of the things that I led with was, look, I think that evolution is a really important subject to teach in schools. And here's what I'm going to tell you. On Sunday, I'm okay with you teaching your kids what you want to teach them about your religion. I'm not here to change your faith. I have to start with that. And you want to, whatever you believe the age of the universe is, on Sunday, you teach that. But on Monday, if you want your kids to help cure cancer, to help cure diabetes, and to be a part of solutions for public health, and to make sure that their parents live longer, then I hope that you'll teach them the framework of evolution, because it's the only one that makes predictions. Intelligent design doesn't make predictions. And you know, it's one step towards getting that curriculum in schools, but it takes time. It takes time to build those relationships. I don't have an easy answer for how to do this. It's hard work, and we've managed to screw things up over the period of decades. It'll take decades to fix it. Oh yeah, I'll repeat the question. Sure.
Yeah. One is that in the appropriations, the non-military part. The military in this country gets a lot more than science does. And I don't understand, you know, I've only lived in this country, and it's always been a mystery to me why there isn't more focus on science. And of course, as a scientist, but it also, the influence of the, I want to say the misinformation, by the pharmaceutical companies. I mean, we're seeing ads all the time. And I know it's the capitalism and it's their, you know, they're lobbying, but in other countries that are not doing this. So I'm wondering, I guess I'm throwing all that at to ask, how do we promote but what you're saying, I guess is the answer, is to do it one teaspoon at a time. Because there's just, the public health system in this country is horrendous. I mean, we have STDs, we have, you know, a decrease in immunization of our children. We have all of these things that, like human papillomavirus, that in other countries are eliminating cervical cancer.
Yeah.
But, you know.
Yeah. Let me just repeat the question. So to shorthand it, why is it that the military industrial complex has such support And we don't have some of the support for science that we would hope we would have in public health and in other areas. Is that a good shorthand? All right. I'm going to start with some optimism for you. So the federal budget for defense is around $780 billion. Pretty big. The federal budget for science is $200 billion. I can't point to much else that's bigger. Science and technology has been, we're very fortunate, a point of emphasis for the country. It just has been. I can't speak to why the defense budgets are so big. That's for folks outside my space. But what I'll tell you is the trend lines for that support are not good. $200 billion is a lot of money. It's more than anybody else spends. Anybody. Just recently, China has gotten very close to that number for their federal investment. But then you look at industry investment, and the U.S. is way ahead in terms of dollars that are spent for R&D and for science and technology. That said, the trend lines aren't good because our rate of growth is like this, and China's is like this. There's no other part in the world, though, that has that kind of rate. We are, even if you look at the world today, we are the second highest growth rate for science and technology. So I don't want us to think that it's not still a priority for the country. The challenge is, how do we make sure that in this world that we described, which is both wondrous and scary as hell, how do we continue that over time? And you stole the answer from me, which is that I do believe it is 1 teaspoon at a time. Those ad campaigns that pharma does, they're the least liked industry in the country, even despite the fact that they talk about discovery all the time. Commercials don't work. I don't care how big your commercial campaign is, that doesn't work. It is building credibility over time. And so we have to do that. On public health is a special case. Public health is one of those things where when there's a challenge and an emergency, suddenly the country sees it and puts lots of money in. After the anthrax cases in 2001, there was a huge influx into our local and state health departments. Huge influx, like $11 billion. And then it slowly went down over time to where a lot of that work has died on the vine before 2019 and 2020. You saw a similar thing in the early 1930s. We had huge health departments in this country. The New York City Health Department had 50,000 employees in the 1930s, mostly because they were quarantining people, they were separating the well from the sick, things that we are fortunate not to be going through today. Now, the challenge is we atrophied a lot of the things that also that changed that situation. The work on informing folks about public health, the work on hopefully working together to understand what vaccination is and how it has changed the country. We've got to do more of that. And that is unfortunately in this country, that a lot of that money comes at the state and local level. And so having again, this idea of engagement networks around the country where scientists and public health professionals can be involved at their community level, at the state government level. This is what we have to do because we are a federated country for good and ill. There's a lot of good that comes with that. You know, we're really lucky that all of our science isn't in a ministry of science. I will tell you, I've seen that around the world, and we are very fortunate that we don't have that here. That decentralization means that the Genome Project can start in the Department of Energy, which is what happened. It means that some of the best immunology work in the world happened in the Cancer Institute. That is a good thing for us, and we got to make sure that we don't ever get to a ministry of science. But it means that we all are a part of this solution. And I hate that I have to put it on to you, but that's the only way it's going to work. We are advocates at the federal level, and we're going to do that work well. I promise you we'll do it well. But to build the support at the state and local level, that's going to require scientists in those states actually taking a role. Yeah.
I'm going to take one question from Zoom.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I can read that. I always wonder that there is a significant disparity between cancer research and cardiovascular research funding, with cancer research receiving more funding. Cardiovascular disease is still the reason most mortality. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're not wrong, although I will say that it's not a giant disparity. So if you look at the NIH's research budgets, the National Cancer Institute is the biggest. The second biggest is the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And so not quite comparably sized. NCI is bigger, but not a lot bigger. What has happened, though, is that there's been political will for cancer research in a way that started in the early 1970s. You saw the war on cancer that we've been fighting for 50 years. That has led to different authorities for the National Cancer Institute. The National Cancer Institute can provide what's called a bypass budget to Congress. What that means is they can provide their professional judgment as to what's needed right now directly to Congress. The National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute and all the other institutes of NIH have to submit their budgets to the president first. The president then puts that into the priorities of the entire executive branch and then sends it to Congress. And so there is a difference in the process around the National Cancer Institute and the National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute, the National Institute on Aging, all the other institutes. At the end of the day, when you look at how science gets funded at the NIH, there is so much crossover. One of the first things I ever did in Washington when I was an intern is coded grants. And so grants were at the NIH, they were in a big database, and I had to look at them and say, this is a cancer grant, this is an immunology grant, this is a neurological grant. Now, anybody that does science knows that there's tremendous crossover of all of those. Do you know how we counted those? We just double counted them. So we counted them twice. And so the numbers that you see in terms of measurements of cancer research and immunology and other things, those are, I'd call them gross estimates. They are not with any kind of precision. The more important thing is to see funding for biomedical research grow overall. And what you'll see is that the pay lines get better. The thing we're arguing for now is to see grant sizes get bigger. The conversation I had this morning with Bill about the fact that the grant size hasn't changed for an R01 in 25 years. And some things have gotten more expensive. And so that's the kind of conversations that we're having right now. And that is an all of NIH, all funding levels discussion, not necessarily one or another institute. Oh.
But how would you respond on how the funding the later be used?
It's a great question. So the question, just in short, is this part about retractions is important, but what about the view of the public, which might see retractions as a dent in credibility for that scientist? It's a great question. It's part of this cultural thing we've got to build. Most folks think that science is like in a textbook where it's settled, and when you say something, you're saying what is the answer. And they don't hear us in our heads saying, this is what we know today, and we're still getting more information. And as that information comes in, we might change our hypothesis. And as a scientist, that's not a big deal. Many of our most famous scientists have put forth a hypothesis and been wrong. Linus Pauling famously, just before Watson and Crick solved the structure of DNA, Linus Pauling had a wonderful model of DNA that was completely wrong, had the bases on the outside. Now, he also solved the structure of the alpha helix, which was a big deal, but he got that completely wrong. And we still don't think any less of Linus Pauling today, because as a scientist, it's much more valuable to put forth a hypothesis and test it. That's what we're supposed to do. Now we have to get that across to, I hate saying general public. There's no such thing as a general public. There are many, many segments of our public, but we've got to be able to get this across to folks. And we can't do that until we've gotten it across in our own culture. And right now, I mean, let's face it, that's not in the culture of the scientific enterprise. If I am a graduate student and there's I need to get my degree, and I need to get to my postdoc, or I need to go into industry, whatever it is, and it's not going to help me to retract something. And so we've got to make sure that there is a reason why you'd want to do that. That correction doesn't just have to be courageous, it actually has to just be the normal part of doing science. And I don't have an easy way to get there, except again, to build those relationships and talk about the fact that science is a human endeavor that makes mistakes.
Thank you. And in the interest of time, I'm gonna, you'll be staying around. If you have questions, come on up. But thank you everyone on Zoom, for participating, and many, many, many comments here about how inspiring your conversation was with us. You've given us a lot to think about. And, just for everyone, we did record Dr. Parikh, so we will have that as soon as we have the recording back, and posted on, the website. Thank you, Dr. Parikh.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Been asked you a question, but I didn't, which was why are we not using influencers?
We're not using
Influencers.
You mean in social media?
The relationship building.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so, you know, the way that it was on that is we have another program that is managed, called ambassadors.
Right.
They're like